Hey guys, welcome back to this channel, The Voice of the Past. In this video, we will unfold the untold story of the Sterling family's forgotten daughter, A Hidden Life, before continuing. If you are new into this channel, please consider subscribing to this channel. Let's start. The Sterling family had always stood as a symbol of power, wealth, and unrelenting ambition. Their name was spoken in hushed admiration at high society galas, printed in bold letters across financial newspapers, and whispered behind closed doors in political circles. The Sterlings didn't just own businesses, they owned influence. For generations, their empire flourished, built upon steel, oil, and an intricate web of alliances that ensured their continued dominance. But power, as history often proved, came at a cost. There was always a price for greatness. And in the case of the Sterling family, the price had been Eleanor Sterling. A name erased. Very few people outside the family remembered Eleanor. Even within the walls of Sterling Manor, her name had become something of a ghost, something that lingered in the background, unspoken, unwelcome. She had once walked those halls, just like her brothers Alexander and Charles. Born the youngest child of Edward and Margaret Sterling, Eleanor had been raised in the same gilded luxury that her brothers enjoyed, yet from the beginning she had been different. Where Alexander had been groomed for leadership and Charles for diplomacy, Eleanor had been left on the edges as if she was an afterthought in the carefully curated legacy of the Sterling dynasty. She had never fit the family's mold. She wasn't poised or obedient. She wasn't interested in the games of power and manipulation that her parents had mastered. Instead, she had been inquisitive, defiant, and far too aware of the cracks in the pristine facade of their lives. Perhaps that was her first mistake. Perhaps it was why, at 16 years old, she disappeared. There were no missing person reports, no frantic newspaper headlines, no desperate search parties combing the estate for the lost Sterling daughter. The family never addressed it. They never spoke of it. And soon, it was as if she had never existed. Her name was stricken from the family records. Her portraits were removed from the gallery. Her memory was erased. Even the household staff, who had once cared for her, who had seen her grow from a child to a young woman, knew better than to ask questions. For 20 years the world forgot Eleanor Sterling, but Eleanor never forgot them. 20 years later, the iron gates of Sterling Manor had not changed. Standing before them, a lone woman gazed up at the estate she had once called home. The world knew her by another name now, a name she had carefully constructed, a name that had shielded her from the past that had tried to consume her. But here, standing before the crest of the Sterling family, she was no one else but Eleanor Sterling. A storm loomed in the distance, thick clouds rolling over the horizon. The cold metal of the gate burned against her fingertips as she traced the intricate engraving of the family emblem. The sight of it sent a sharp jolt through her chest. For years she had imagined this moment. She had dreamed of returning, of standing before the grand estate that had once been a prison, of walking through the halls that had held so many secrets. She had sworn to uncover the truth, to unravel the lies that had kept her in the dark for so long, to take back what had been stolen from her. But now that she was here, the weight of those memories threatened to crush her. The last time she had seen this place, she had been a terrified girl, a girl who had no control over her fate, a girl whose very existence had been deemed a problem that needed to be erased. But Eleanor was not that girl anymore. She had survived, and now she had come back not as a victim, but as a reckoning. She was going to uncover the truth, even if it meant destroying the Sterling family in the process. But she had underestimated just how deep their secrets ran. And some secrets were never meant to be unearthed. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. And as Eleanor Sterling took her first step toward the manor, she had no idea that she was about to uncover something far darker than she had ever imagined. The iron gates creaked open, the sound echoing through the vast, empty drive leading to Sterling Manor. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the approaching storm threatening to break at any moment. Eleanor took a slow breath, steadying herself before stepping forward. The estate loomed before her, its grand marble columns and towering windows as imposing as they had been 2 decades ago. She had been just 16 when she last walked this path. Back then, she had been nothing more than a frightened girl, cast aside like a discarded secret. Now, she was a woman with a purpose. She reached the large oak doors and hesitated. A part of her had expected resistance, some obstacle that would keep her from entering. But no security guards emerged. No locked doors blocked her path. It was almost as if they were waiting for her. With a steadying breath, she pushed open the door. The house smelled the same, a mix of old wood, faint cigar smoke, and expensive perfume. Stepping inside, Eleanor felt the weight of the past settle on her shoulders. The grand foyer stretched out before her, the familiar black and white marble floors gleaming under the dim chandelier light. She ran a hand over the polished banister of the grand staircase. This house had been a prison once. Now it was her battlefield. A voice echoed from deeper within the house. "Who is it?" She turned sharply. From the shadows, a woman stepped forward. Margaret Sterling, her mother. She looked older but no less formidable. The years had deepened the lines on her face, but her posture remained perfectly poised, her gaze sharp as ever. For a long moment, there was silence. Then Margaret whispered, as if speaking to a ghost, "Eleanor?" The disbelief in her mother's voice sent a chill through Eleanor's spine. She had imagined this moment countless times, what she would say, how she would stand tall in the face of the woman who had let her disappear without a second thought. But standing here now, facing her mother after 20 years, the words lodged in her throat. Margaret took a step closer, her hands trembling. "It's not possible. You're dead?" Eleanor finished the sentence for her. Her voice was calm, controlled, but she saw how her mother flinched at the word. Yes, that was what they had told the world, wasn't it? That she was dead, that she no longer existed. And yet, here she was. Margaret's lips pressed together, regaining her composure in an instant. Her sharp eyes studied Eleanor with a mix of shock and something else. Fear. Eleanor saw it, clear as day. Her mother was afraid. Good. Margaret's voice hardened. "Why are you here?" Eleanor took a slow step forward. "To uncover the truth." A flicker of something crossed Margaret's face before it disappeared behind her carefully crafted mask. "There is nothing to uncover," she said, voice clipped. "You left. You made your choice." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "Is that the story you tell yourself?" A beat of silence. Then Margaret inhaled sharply, straightening her shoulders. "You should leave, Eleanor. The past is best left buried." But Eleanor only smiled, cold and knowing. "You buried me once, Mother." Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the air like a blade. "I won't let you do it again." Margaret's face paled, but before she could say anything, another voice cut through the tension. "What the hell is going on?" Eleanor turned just as her older brother, Alexander Sterling, entered the room. He was taller, broader, and carried the same commanding presence their father once had. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, but his piercing blue eyes remained unchanged, calculating and sharp. When his gaze landed on Eleanor, his entire body stiffened. His reaction was different from Margaret's. There was no shock, no confusion, just cold recognition. He knew. He had always known. Eleanor's stomach twisted, but she kept her expression unreadable. "Hello, Alexander," she said smoothly, tilting her head. "Did you miss me?" His jaw clenched. "You shouldn't be here," she smiled. "And yet, here I am." Silence stretched between them like a knife's edge. Margaret glanced between them, then exhaled sharply. "Enough. We'll discuss this in the study." Eleanor didn't move. "Why not here? Are you afraid the walls might finally speak the truth?" Her mother's eyes flashed with warning. "You have no idea what you are stepping into." Eleanor held her gaze. "Then enlighten me." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a loud thunderclap shook the house. And in that split second, a single moment of distraction, Eleanor caught something from the corner of her eye. A figure, a shadow moving along the upper balcony of the grand staircase, watching them. Before she could react, it was gone. A shiver ran down Eleanor's spine. She had expected lies. She had expected resistance. But she had not expected this. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And as she followed her family into the study, she realized one chilling truth. The secrets buried within Sterling Manor ran deeper than she had ever imagined. And someone was watching her. Waiting. For what? She didn't know. But she was about to find out. Eleanor followed Margaret and Alexander through the dimly lit corridors of Sterling Manor, her every step measured, her senses sharp. The weight of the house bore down on her like a living entity, its walls whispering secrets only she could hear. The study was just as she remembered. Dark mahogany shelves lined with ancient books, a massive fireplace, and an air of suffocating authority. It had been their father's domain, the place where decisions had been made, where fates had been sealed, where her fate had been sealed. Margaret took a seat in the high-backed chair near the fireplace, her fingers tightening around the carved wooden armrests. Alexander stood near the desk, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Eleanor remained standing. She wasn't here to be comfortable. "Why did you come back?" Alexander finally asked. His voice was quiet, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Eleanor smiled, slow and deliberate. "You mean, why didn't I stay buried?" A flicker of something passed across his face. Annoyance, perhaps, or something darker. Margaret exhaled sharply. "Enough of this. If you came for money, you won't get it. If you came for revenge, you won't find it here." Eleanor tilted her head. "You assume I want revenge? What else could you possibly want?" Margaret's voice was cold. Eleanor's smile faded. "The truth." Silence. A storm rumbled in the distance, shaking the house ever so slightly. Alexander finally broke the silence. "The truth won't change anything. You should leave." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "That's not your decision to make, dear brother." His jaw tightened. "You don't belong here anymore." "I never did," she shot back. The tension between them was razor sharp, but Eleanor didn't flinch. She had spent 20 years preparing for this. She wasn't going to be intimidated by a family that had discarded her. Margaret suddenly rose to her feet. "Eleanor, listen to me carefully. You have no idea what you're stepping into." Eleanor studied her mother's face, searching for something: fear, regret, guilt. But Margaret Sterling had never been one to show weakness, and yet Eleanor knew. She was hiding something. Before Eleanor could push further, the door creaked open. A tall, older man entered the study. For a moment, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Charles, her other brother. She hadn't seen him since the day she disappeared. He looked different. Older, of course. His once youthful arrogance had been replaced by something more worn, weary. His gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment, the carefully curated masks of the Sterling family slipped. Charles looked shaken. He wasn't like Alexander. There was no immediate dismissal, no cold indifference. Just shock. and something that looked dangerously close to guilt. "Eleanor," he whispered. Eleanor met his gaze. "Miss me?" Charles swallowed hard. "You shouldn't have come back." Eleanor took a step closer. "Why? What are you afraid of?" His throat bobbed. He glanced toward Alexander and Margaret, as if seeking their approval before speaking. But then he surprised her. He turned back to Eleanor and said, "Come with me." Margaret stiffened. "Charles." "No," he cut her off, his voice sharper than Eleanor had expected. "She deserves to know." Alexander scowled. "Don't be ridiculous. Enough." Charles's voice was firm, unshakable. "You've lied long enough. We all have." Margaret's lips thinned. Alexander said nothing. For the first time, Eleanor saw a crack in their control. Her heart pounded. Charles turned back to her. "Come with me, Eleanor. I'll show you what they don't want you to see." Eleanor hesitated only for a second. Then she followed him. Eleanor followed Charles through the dimly lit corridors of Sterling Manor, her pulse quickening with each step. The weight of her mother's warning and Alexander's cold indifference still lingered in her mind, but Charles had been different. He wanted her to know something, something the others had spent 20 years trying to bury. They passed familiar hallways, the grand staircase, the portraits of their ancestors staring down at them with hollow eyes. But Charles didn't stop until they reached the farthest wing of the manor, an area Eleanor hadn't stepped into since she was a child. The air here was different, stale, forgotten. Charles paused in front of a door she didn't remember ever seeing before, a heavy wooden door, slightly warped from time, with an iron handle that looked centuries old. Eleanor's stomach twisted. "What is this?" she asked. Charles exhaled slowly. "The part of our family's history they don't want you to know." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a key, and inserted it into the lock. The door groaned as it swung open. The room beyond was dark, cold. The faint scent of old paper and something metallic filled the air. Eleanor hesitated for a second before stepping inside. Charles flicked a switch. Dim lights buzzed to life, revealing a hidden study, smaller than their father's grand office but filled with stacks of old documents, faded photographs, and locked cabinets. Eleanor scanned the room, her eyes landing on a large oak desk against the wall. Atop it sat a single leather-bound journal. It looked ancient. Charles walked forward, picked up the journal, and turned to her. "Read this." Eleanor took it from him, hesitating only for a moment before flipping it open. Her eyes skimmed the first page. Then she froze. Her father's handwriting. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned another page. She hadn't seen his handwriting since before she had disappeared. The entries were dated decades ago, but one in particular made her breath catch. March 3rd, 20 years ago. "It is done. Eleanor has been removed. Margaret insisted it was the only way to protect the family. The girl asked too many questions. She would have ruined everything. She will not remember. It is better this way." Eleanor's breath hitched. She read it again and again. She will not remember. She felt her knees buckle, the world tilting for a moment. Charles reached out, steadying her. "Eleanor, what does this mean?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but she already knew. Deep down, she already knew. Charles's jaw tightened. "You were never supposed to find out." Eleanor gripped the journal, her knuckles white. "Find out what?" Charles exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "That they didn't just erase you from the family records. They erased your memories too." Silence. A sharp, deafening silence that made Eleanor's heart pound violently against her ribs. No, that couldn't be true. She had always known something had been wrong. Gaps in her memories, moments that felt blurred, pieces of her past that never quite fit together. But she had told herself it was trauma, She had told herself it was because she had been young. She had never once considered that someone had done this to her. She looked up at Charles, her voice shaking. How? Charles hesitated. Then, our father knew people. People who could make things disappear. Not just names, not just records, memories, Eleanor. The room spun around her. She felt sick. For 20 years, she had lived a life built on a lie. They had taken everything from her, and they had expected her never to come back. But she had, and now she would make them pay. Eleanor stared at the journal, her father's words burning into her mind like fire. She will not remember. It is better this way. Her hands trembled as she clutched the leather-bound book. The air in the hidden study felt thick, suffocating. They had erased her, not just from the family's history, not just from the world, but from herself. She staggered backward, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. She barely registered Charles stepping toward her. "Eleanor, listen to me." His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it. Guilt. "How much?" Her voice was hoarse. "How much did they take?" Charles hesitated. His silence was the worst answer of all. Eleanor's hands tightened into fists. Her mind reeled, trying to piece together the fragments of a past she had never even known was missing. Memories? Lost time? Things that had never made sense. She had always felt like a puzzle with missing pieces, like a story with torn-out pages. Now she knew why. Her family had stolen them from her. She sucked in a sharp breath. "What did I know, Charles?" Her voice was eerily calm now. "What was I asking that made them do this to me?" Charles looked away. "Tell me," Eleanor's voice cracked, not from weakness but from rage. Charles exhaled, his shoulders slumping slightly. He seemed to struggle with himself before he finally spoke. "You found out about Sterling Manor's real history." Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. "What history?" Charles turned toward one of the bookshelves. He ran his fingers along the edges of the dusty books before pulling one free. He handed it to her. She glanced down. A family ledger. She flipped through the pages, scanning the records. Some of the entries were normal. Business dealings, estate transactions, property records. Then she saw something that made her blood run cold. Her eyes widened. This isn't just an estate record." Charles nodded grimly. "Number. It's a record of who has lived and disappeared from Sterling Manor over the last century." Eleanor's breath hitched as she traced her fingers over the faded ink. So many names. Names that had been crossed out, vanished, forgotten. Some of them were marked with a single chilling word. Removed. Her stomach turned violently. This is why they took my memories, isn't it?" Eleanor whispered. Charles nodded slowly. "You must have found out something they couldn't afford to let you remember." Eleanor flipped the pages frantically, her hands shaking. Then she froze, because there, near the bottom of a much older page, was a name she had never seen before. But the last name was unmistakable. Eleanor Margaret Sterling. And beneath it, another name, Emmeline Sterling. Eleanor's eyes widened. "Who is this?" Charles swallowed hard. "You wouldn't remember her." Eleanor looked up, heart hammering. "Why?" Charles closed his eyes for a second, as if gathering the strength to say it. Then, finally, "Because she was your sister." Eleanor stared at the name on the ledger, her breath catching in her throat. Emmeline Sterling. A name she had never heard. A sister she had never known. She looked up at Charles, her vision blurring at the edges. "What do you mean she was my sister?" Charles rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion and guilt weighing heavy in his features. "She was older than you, by 3 years." Eleanor gripped the desk, her entire body rigid. "That's not possible. I was the youngest. No, Eleanor. Charles's voice was quiet. That's just what they wanted you to believe. The room tilted around her. A storm of emotions, rage, disbelief, fear, raged inside her like a wildfire. Where is she? Eleanor's voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of 20 years of betrayal. Charles hesitated. She disappeared. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. Disappeared? Or was she erased, just like me? Charles looked away. That was answer enough. Eleanor felt sick. Her parents had erased her existence, erased her memories, erased her very identity to protect the Sterling name. And now she learned she wasn't even the first. What happened to her, Charles? He hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything. Eleanor felt a sharp pain in her chest. She's dead, isn't she? Charles's jaw tightened. She found out too much, just like you. He exhaled shakily. Father and mother couldn't let that happen. Eleanor's breath hitched. They killed her? No. His voice was hoarse. But they had her removed. Eleanor nearly collapsed. Her whole body felt numb. Her parents had done this before. She wasn't the first Sterling daughter to be erased. She was just the first one who had survived. Eleanor closed her eyes, flashes of half-formed memories slamming into her mind like a tidal wave. A voice, a girl's laughter in the halls, a presence, always there, a sister, a protector, and then a scream, a door slamming shut, and then nothing, darkness, emptiness, like it had all been scrubbed from her mind. They took her from me. Her voice was barely above a whisper, her fingers trembling. They took her from me, just like they tried to take me from myself. Charles looked pained. Eleanor, I wanted to stop them. I was only 19. I didn't know what to do. She snapped her gaze toward him. And yet you did nothing. Charles flinched, shame flickering across his face. I was a coward. Eleanor's breath shook. Where is she buried? Silence. Charles didn't speak. That's when she understood. Her hands curled into fists. She isn't buried, is she? Charles didn't answer. She felt ice-cold rage settle in her chest. They don't even have a grave for her. Charles finally looked at her, his face broken with guilt. I don't know where she is, Eleanor. I tried to find out, but I never could. Eleanor's mind raced, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to find out, and she knew exactly where to start. Confrontation. Eleanor stormed into the main hall, her heart thundering. Margaret Sterling was waiting. Of course, she was. Her mother stood at the base of the grand staircase, poised, elegant, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. Eleanor stopped before her, anger burning in her veins. Tell me about Emmeline. Margaret's face did not change, not even a flicker of emotion. There is nothing to tell. Eleanor took a step closer, her voice like steel. I remember her. A flicker, barely perceptible. But Eleanor saw it. Margaret's perfect mask had cracked. Eleanor pressed on. You took her from me, just like you tried to take my memories, just like you tried to take my life. Her mother tilted her head slightly, and yet, here you are. Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. Where is she? Margaret exhaled as if exhausted. Eleanor, some things are better left buried. Eleanor laughed bitterly. You would know all about that, wouldn't you? Margaret finally showed true emotion. Anger. You should have stayed gone, Eleanor. Her voice was no longer cool and composed. You don't understand the cost of being part of this family. Eleanor took another step forward, her voice deadly calm. No, Mother. You don't understand the cost of taking everything from me. Margaret stiffened. Eleanor smiled. I'm going to burn it all down. A heavy silence settled between them, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor saw fear in Margaret Sterling's eyes. The truth uncovered. Eleanor spent the next 6 months unraveling the mystery of Emmeline Sterling. She combed through records, dug into family archives, questioned former staff, bribed contacts, and traveled across the country. And then, one day, she found her, or what remained of her. A forgotten grave, hidden on a remote part of the Sterling estate, unmarked, unnoticed. But Eleanor knew. Her sister had been there all along. She placed a hand on the grave, her vision blurring with unshed tears. They tried to erase you. Her voice was barely above a whisper. But I will never let them erase you again. She had been stolen, forgotten, silenced, but no more. Eleanor stood up, her heart steady. It was time to expose everything. The world would know the truth about the Sterling family, and she would make sure no one ever erased her name again. Eleanor Sterling was back, and she was never disappearing again. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more stories like this, hit that like button and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And let me know on which topic you would like to see stories next. And check out these other stories you might enjoy. See you in the next one. Till then, take care and goodbye.